A bond beyond words. The courtroom air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the walls. Michael Carter sat rigid in his chair, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him. His uniform, a badge of honor he had worn for 15 years, was gone, replaced by a plain blue jumpsuit that made him feel like a stranger to himself. His chest tightened as he tried to process the words that had just been spoken. Guilty. The judge's voice rang out like a thunderclap in a summer storm, sending shockwaves through Michael's body. It was a word he had never thought would be associated with his name. He had dedicated his life to upholding justice, yet here he was, labeled as a man who had betrayed the very system he had sworn to serve. He barely heard the rest of the sentence. The numbers didn't matter. The years, the fines, the procedures, none of it registered. What haunted him, what truly broke him, was the knowledge that he wouldn't see him again. Luke, his K-9 partner, his best friend, his shadow. Michael's gaze lifted slightly, scanning the room until his eyes landed on the back of the courtroom. There he was, his loyal German shepherd, sitting at attention beside another officer. Luke's ears were perked, his deep brown eyes locked onto Michael as if he understood everything that was happening. His tail didn't wag. He didn't move. He simply watched. Michael swallowed hard. The pain in his chest was unbearable. How could he explain to Luke that he wouldn't be coming home? How could he tell him that their runs in the park, their long shifts together, their bond, one forged in sweat, in danger, in trust, was about to be shattered? The judge was rising now, his gavel poised to bring the proceeding to an end. The sound of shuffling papers and murmuring voices filled the room. The bailiff moved closer, preparing to escort Michael away. He couldn't let it end like this. Your Honor. Michael's voice cracked, raw with emotion. He swallowed against the lump in his throat and tried again. Please, before I go, I have one request. The judge hesitated, narrowing his eyes as he studied Michael. The room fell silent. Even the lawyers, the jury, the spectators, everyone paused, sensing the weight of whatever was about to be said. I just need to say goodbye to Luke. A soft murmur swept through the courtroom. Some were confused, others intrigued. The judge's expression remained unreadable as he glanced toward the back of the room, where Luke sat, his posture unwavering. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the judge finally exhaled, setting his gavel down with a measured thud. 3 minutes. His voice was firm but not unkind. Then you will be taken into custody. That was all Michael needed. The second the officer loosened Luke's leash, the dog bolted forward, claws clicking loudly against the polished floor. Gasps echoed through the room, but Michael wasn't paying attention. He dropped to his knees just as Luke reached him, and the impact nearly knocked the wind out of him. Michael buried his face into Luke's thick fur, inhaling his familiar scent. Home, loyalty, everything he was about to lose. His arms wrapped around the dog's strong body, holding on as tightly as he could. I'm so sorry, buddy, he whispered, his voice trembling. I let you down. I won't be there anymore. Luke let out a soft whimper, pressing his muzzle into Michael's shoulder, as if to say, I don't understand. Why is this happening? Tears burned behind Michael's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had never cried in front of Luke, not when they had been injured on duty, not when they had lost fellow officers, not even on the worst of days. He had always been strong for his partner. But now, strength felt impossible. Just as Michael was about to pull away, Luke tensed. It was sudden, sharp. His ears perked higher, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed at Michael's jacket. A second later, he let out a short, urgent bark. Michael pulled back slightly, frowning. What is it, boy? Luke's nose worked furiously against the fabric of Michael's jumpsuit, his body language shifting from sorrow to something else entirely. Alertness. He whined, tugged at the material with his teeth, then barked again, louder this time. The sharp sound startled the room. What's going on? One of the bailiffs asked, stepping forward cautiously. Luke didn't stop. He pulled harder, his paws shifting restlessly against the floor. His deep, intelligent eyes flicked up to Michael's for the briefest moment, then back to his jacket. Something was wrong. The air in the courtroom changed. Officers who had been standing idly began moving, their hands instinctively shifting toward their belts. The judge remained seated, but his gaze sharpened. Michael's pulse quickened. He knew Luke better than he knew himself, and Luke never reacted like this unless he had found something. A moment later, something small and metallic slipped from Michael's jacket and hit the floor with a soft clink. The entire courtroom froze. Michael blinked, staring at the tiny object, a recording device. His breath caught in his throat. Whispers erupted around the room. Some people leaned forward, their curiosity growing. Others stiffened, sensing that something significant had just happened. The judge's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "Pick it up." An officer hesitated before stepping forward, bending down to retrieve the recorder. He held it up for all to see, his brows knitting together. "What is this?" the judge demanded. Silence. Then, from the prosecution's table, a voice cut in, sharp, desperate. "That doesn't belong here." Michael turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the prosecutor. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming along his brow. Something inside Michael's gut twisted. He knew. The prosecutor knew exactly what that device was, and judging by the fear in his eyes, whatever was on it was damning. Michael's breath came fast and shallow as he stared at the object. For weeks, he had told himself that the evidence had been planted, that he had been framed, but he had no way to prove it. Until now. Luke let out another bark, his stance unwavering. He had found the truth, and now it was about to change everything. The judge straightened in his chair. His expression darkened as he turned his gaze toward the officer holding the recorder. "Activated," he ordered. And just like that, the entire courtroom held its breath. The sound of static filled the room. Then, after a moment, muffled voices crackled through the speakers. Michael's heartbeat thundered in his ears. And then, "Just plant the evidence. No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." Gasps erupted like gunfire. Michael's body went rigid. He knew that voice. It was a voice he had trusted, respected. A voice that had guided him through his years on the force. Captain Ray Harding. His own superior. The room was no longer just tense. It was electrified with shock. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his face drained of color. This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, but his voice wavered. The judge, however, was already slamming his gavel down. Enough. Michael's heart pounded furiously in his chest. His whole world had just turned upside down, but for the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Luke had found the truth, and now nothing would ever be the same. The turning point. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating and inescapable. Every person in that room had just heard the undeniable truth, the setup, the deception, the betrayal, and the voice on that recording. It belonged to none other than Captain Ray Harding. Michael Carter's mind raced, his pulse hammering against his ribcage. His breath felt shallow, uneven, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. For weeks, he had pleaded his innocence, shouted into the void, only to be met with cold indifference. And now, a simple twist of fate, his loyal partner's unwavering instincts, had unearthed what no lawyer, no detective, no investigator had been able to. Luke sat by his side, his tail still, his ears alert. His deep brown eyes flickered between Michael and the judge, as if waiting for what would happen next. The judge, a man who had moments ago sentenced Michael to a fate he did not deserve, was now the only person in the room with the authority to correct this grave mistake. He leaned forward, his hands steepled before him, his face unreadable. "Officer, secure that device," he commanded, his voice firm. The officer holding the recording device hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, placing it carefully on the judge's desk. The judge pressed a button on his intercom. "Bailiff, clear this courtroom immediately. I want only essential personnel present. Everyone else, leave." The murmurs turned into protests. The media representatives in the back stood quickly, whispering hurriedly into their microphones before being ushered out. Lawyers exchanged hushed words, uncertainty clouding their faces. Some jurors hesitated, seemingly torn between their civic duty and their burning curiosity. But the bailiffs wasted no time, their presence imposing as they moved efficiently to ensure compliance. Within minutes, the large room was empty except for Michael, his legal counsel, the judge, the prosecutor, several officers, and Captain Harding, who had just entered, summoned by an urgent message. Harding's expression was one of carefully crafted professionalism, but Michael knew him too well. There was something behind his eyes, something calculating. The man hadn't heard the recording yet, and Michael could only imagine what was about to unfold. The judge cleared his throat. "Captain Harding, do you recognize this device?" His tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent of something sharp beneath it. Harding's gaze flicked to the small recorder resting on the judge's desk. His lips pressed into a thin line before he spoke. "I can't say that I do, Your Honor." His voice was steady, but Michael caught the slight twitch in his jaw. "Then perhaps we should play it again." The judge reached forward and pressed the button. The room filled once more with static before the damning words crackled through the air. "Just plant the evidence. No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." This time, Michael wasn't watching the judge or the prosecutor. He was watching Harding. For the briefest moment, just a fraction of a second, something flickered across the captain's face. A recognition, a realization. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced with a mask of practiced indignation. "This is absurd." Harding let out a forced scoff, shaking his head. "Where did this so-called evidence even come from? It wasn't presented during the trial. I don't know whose voice that is, but it sure as hell isn't mine." Michael clenched his fists. He knew that voice. He had worked under Harding for years. He had trusted him with his life. That voice, the arrogance, the cold calculation, it belonged to Harding. But the man was slipping into damage control. "Your Honor," Harding continued, adopting a tone of feigned concern. "This could have been fabricated. Anyone with some technical skills could have doctored that audio." The prosecutor, who had been shaken just moments ago, latched onto this argument like a lifeline. "Exactly, Your Honor. We can't verify the authenticity of this recording. It's inadmissible." The judge didn't respond right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden desk. Then, he turned to Michael. "Officer Carter." His voice was direct, expectant. "Do you recognize that voice?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. That's Captain Harding. I'd bet my life on it." His jaw tightened as he locked eyes with his former superior. "And I believe that recording is the key to proving I was framed." Harding let out a humorless chuckle. "Of course you do," he muttered under his breath. Michael ignored him. "Luke found it, Your Honor." He sensed something was off. "I don't know how it ended up on me, but my guess is someone who knew the truth wanted it to be discovered before it was too late." The judge studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to the officers in the room. "I want this recording analyzed immediately," he ordered. "If there's any manipulation, we'll know soon enough. If it's legitimate, then we have a serious problem on our hands." Harding opened his mouth to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Until we have our answer, Officer Carter will not be taken into custody." Michael's heart nearly stopped. Did he just hear that correctly? The judge turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You will remain in holding, but your sentence is on pause. If the evidence proves what you claim, you will be a free man. But if this turns out to be a hoax, you'll be facing new charges." His gaze shifted to Harding. "And so will anyone involved." For the first time since this nightmare began, Michael felt something stir within him. Hope. Harding's nostrils flared slightly, but he said nothing. His mask of calm was cracking, just a little. The judge nodded to the bailiffs. "Escort Officer Carter back to holding. This matter is far from over." Michael exhaled, long and slow, before rising to his feet. He turned toward Luke, who still sat by his side, unshaken, unwavering. Michael bent down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You did good, buddy." His voice was quiet but filled with gratitude. Luke let out a low whine and nuzzled against him, as if saying, "I've got your back. Always." As Michael was led away, he stole one last glance at Harding. The man remained still, his face unreadable. But Michael saw the shift in his eyes. Fear. It was subtle, buried beneath years of practiced authority. But it was there. Michael wasn't out of the woods yet, but the tide had turned. And for the first time in weeks, he wasn't just fighting for his innocence. He was fighting to bring the truth to light. The unraveling truth. The holding cell was cold, the concrete walls devoid of any comfort. Michael sat on the stiff bench, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as his mind raced. He had spent weeks here, drowning in the helplessness of being condemned for a crime he hadn't committed. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was hope. Luke had given him that hope, his instincts, his unwavering loyalty. That tiny recording device, seemingly insignificant, had cracked open the deception that had stolen Michael's freedom. But the battle wasn't over yet. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. He needed to think ahead. If Harding was behind this setup, then who else was involved? A frame job this calculated wasn't the work of one man. There had to be others. Officers, attorneys, maybe even people higher up in the department. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. The iron bars rattled as a guard unlocked the cell door. "Carter, you've got a visitor." Michael's brows furrowed. A visitor? At this hour? The guard stepped aside, and an older man walked in. Dressed in a dark suit, his expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something intense. He wasn't a lawyer, at least not one Michael recognized. The door shut behind them with a heavy clang. "Officer Carter," the man greeted, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Richard Calloway. I work with Internal Affairs." Michael stiffened. Internal Affairs. That explained the authority in his stance. "Internal Affairs," he echoed. "You investigating my case?" Calloway sighed, pulling out a chair from the corner of the room and sitting across from Michael. "More like investigating the people responsible for putting you in here." He leaned forward slightly, his tone quieter now. "The recording from today. It's not the first time Harding's name has come up in something suspicious." Michael's jaw clenched. "You knew. Not everything." "Not yet." Calloway studied him for a moment. "But let's just say your case isn't the only one where the evidence didn't quite add up. Harding has been protected for a long time, and whoever's backing him, they've got a lot of power." Michael exhaled through his nose, his mind running through the implications. This wasn't just about him. There were others. Other officers, maybe even civilians, whose lives had been destroyed by Harding's schemes. "So what happens now?" Michael asked. Calloway leaned back, crossing his arms. "That depends on you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're working to authenticate that recording. But even if it's real, we'll need more than that to bring Harding down." Michael frowned. "More?" He gestured at himself. "I'm sitting in a damn cell because of this setup. What more do you need?" Calloway's eyes darkened. "Harding isn't just some dirty cop planting evidence. He's connected to people who have a vested interest in keeping him untouchable. If we don't build this case right, he walks, and you stay in here." Michael's stomach twisted at the thought. He had already spent weeks fighting for his innocence. He couldn't afford to lose again. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Calloway studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You and Harding worked together for years. If there's anything that seemed off, even before this setup, now's the time to speak up." Michael's mind raced back through his years on the force. Harding had always been respected, a mentor figure to many, including Michael. But now, looking back with fresh eyes, he could see it. The moments that didn't make sense. The cases where things fell into place too easily. The times Harding had made certain evidence disappear when it didn't fit the department's narrative. And then there was that one case, the one that had always lingered in Michael's mind. A year ago, a rookie officer named Daniels had been dismissed from the force. The reason given? Mishandling evidence. But Michael had always doubted the official explanation. Daniels had been sharp, honest, and meticulous. The kind of cop who wouldn't make the kind of mistake that would get him fired. What if Daniels had seen something he wasn't supposed to? What if Harding had set him up too? Michael clenched his fists. There's something. A case from last year. An officer named Daniels. He was fired for evidence tampering. But I never believed it. His eyes locked onto Calloway's. If Harding was willing to throw me under the bus, there's no way I was the first. Calloway nodded slowly. That's the kind of lid we need. I'll dig into Daniel's case. But Carter. His expression grew even more serious. You need to be careful. If Harding suspects we're closing in, he won't hesitate to cover his tracks. And that means making sure you never get out of here. Michael exhaled, his chest tight. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. This was about taking down a system that had protected corruption for far too long. The door creaked open, and the guard stepped inside. Time's up. Calloway stood, adjusting his suit. Stay sharp, Carter. If anything feels off, call for me. He hesitated before adding, and keep your dog close. I have a feeling you're going to need him. Michael nodded, watching as Calloway left. The door shut behind him, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. Luke. Michael's chest ached at the thought of his K-9 partner. He needed to see him again, not just because Luke was the only one who had believed in him from the start, but because if things were about to get worse, he wanted his best friend by his side. And deep down, he had a feeling the fight was far from over. The final stand. The air inside the holding cell was thick with unspoken tension. Michael sat on the cold bench, his mind racing as he processed everything internal affairs had told him. Harding wasn't just corrupt. He was protected by people who wanted to keep him in power. If Michael wanted to clear his name, he wasn't just fighting against one man. He was fighting against an entire system built to silence the truth. And time was running out. The door to the holding area opened, and the guard returned. You've got another visitor, he said, though his voice carried a strange unease. Michael stood, expecting Calloway again, but his stomach clenched when he saw who stepped inside. Captain Ray Harding. Dressed in his usual pristine uniform, Harding carried himself with the same confidence as always, but there was something different in his eyes now. He wasn't here to intimidate. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here to warn. The guard hesitated for a moment, then shut the door, leaving the two men alone. A thick silence settled between them before Harding finally spoke. You should have just taken your sentence, Carter. Michael's jaw tightened. That an order, Captain. Harding exhaled slowly, as if disappointed. You don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. This isn't about me. There are people watching this case, people who don't like loose ends. They don't care about what's fair or just. They care about control. He tilted his head slightly. And you're a loose end. Michael felt the weight of those words settle deep into his chest. He had always known there was more to this than just Harding. But now, the captain was practically admitting it. Then why are you here? Michael asked, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. Harding's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I had respect for you once, and I still think you were one of the best cops I ever trained." He leaned forward slightly. "And because I'm giving you one last chance to walk away." Michael's expression didn't change. "What are you offering?" Harding sighed, his eyes darkening. "Recant your statement. Say the recording was planted, that you don't recognize the voices. Do that, and you'll be released quietly, with a reduced sentence. You'll get your life back. Well, most of it." Michael let out a humorless chuckle. "And if I don't?" Harding's expression hardened. "Then you won't make it to trial." A thick silence stretched between them. Michael had spent his life chasing criminals, confronting danger. He knew when a threat was empty and when it was real. Harding wasn't bluffing. If Michael didn't back down, he wouldn't just be fighting for justice. He'd be fighting for his life. "No deal," Michael said, his voice unwavering. Harding studied him, then shook his head with a sigh. "I figured you'd say that." He turned toward the door, knocking once for the guard. Before leaving, he glanced back one last time. "I tried harder." Then, without another word, he stepped out, the heavy door clanking shut behind him. Michael exhaled, gripping his hands into fists. The game had changed. Part 5. The truth breaks free. The next morning, chaos erupted in the courthouse. The forensic team had confirmed the recording was authentic. No tampering, no manipulation. The voice was undeniably Captain Ray Harding. Michael was transported back to the courtroom, this time without cuffs. The judge sat behind his bench, his expression grim as he addressed the courtroom. "This case has taken an unexpected turn. New evidence has come to light that suggests Officer Carter was, in fact, framed." His gaze flickered toward Harding, who sat at the prosecution table, his face unreadable. Michael didn't have time to react before the doors at the back of the room burst open. "Luke!" His loyal partner sprinted down the aisle, barking loudly as he made his way to Michael. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but Michael didn't care. He dropped to one knee as Luke reached him, the German shepherd pressing his head into Michael's chest. "Good boy," Michael whispered, scratching behind Luke's ears. The judge allowed the moment to pass before clearing his throat. "Officer Carter, in light of this new evidence, your conviction is overturned. You are hereby reinstated as an officer of the law." Michael's heart pounded. It was over. The weight that had crushed him for weeks suddenly lifted. But as he looked toward Harding, he saw something shift in the man's expression, a hint of panic. "Your Honor," one of the IA investigators spoke, standing abruptly. "Given the severity of this corruption, we request that Captain Harding be taken into custody immediately for further questioning." Before Harding could react, two officers approached him, their hands resting on their belts. He remained still for a moment, then slowly raised his hands. "This isn't over," he muttered, but this time his voice lacked the authority it once carried. As they escorted Harding away, Michael stood, feeling Luke press against his leg. He glanced down at his partner, exhaling slowly. "We did it, buddy." Luke wagged his tail, as if he had known the truth all along. Epilogue. A new beginning. Weeks later, Michael stood outside the station, the weight of his badge heavier than he remembered. He ran his fingers over the emblem, taking in the moment. Harding was facing multiple charges. Others involved in the corruption were being investigated. And while Michael knew the fight against injustice wasn't over, today he had won. A familiar bark made him turn. Luke stood beside him, tail wagging, ready for their next mission. Michael smiled. He wasn't just a cop. He was free. And with Luke by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.